Greetings comic lovers and welcome back to Casually Comics, the channel where we chat all things comics, from reviews of comics new and old to history to anecdotes, really wherever our whims take us. Clayface 3, Clayface the Third. We're moving on down the Clayface line. We've arrived at Preston Payne, Bronze Age Clayface, who debuted in 1978. A Clayface who would find love with the fourth Clayface and be father to the fifth. A character who would be used years later as a metaphor for a crisis that would be both critiqued and praised. Oh, and he has a lady love who is a mannequin. 5, take notes. It's fascinating charting the Clayfaces, because thus far we've had one from each era. So the tones and manners in which they are depicted is as interesting to analyze as the characters themselves, and it continues here. It's time for Clayface again. But before we get started, I'm Sasha, and if you're enjoying this content, you know what to do. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, join us on this comic book journey. Preston Payne was created by Len Wein and Marshall Rogers, and debuted in Detective Comics 478 in a two-part story that also saw him dealing with a less even keel than usual Batman, who was still reeling from his breakup with Silver St. Cloud, one of his great loves. She was one of his love interests who was aware of his dual identity, and in fact she broke up with him because he was Batman. So being Batman at that point kinda stung. But he's not what's interesting about this story, Clayface is. Well, he's not all that's interesting about this story. It's mostly Clayface. Clayface is back. And this girl was his first victim. You will be next, Batman. I love when the classic covers yell at the people on them. We see a hand covered in clay, dripping, oozing, just as the woman herself is an ooze. Right away, the body horror elements have been dialed up from back during the second Clayface's start, where yes, he was clay, but the focus wasn't quite on the horror as of yet. The coming of Clayface 3. Our opening sequence is Batman unleashing on some robbers to set up that he is not in a good headspace, which is going to impact how he deals with Clayface, who we meet on page 5. A mysterious cloaked figure is trying to make his way out of Star Labs with a device, but he's stopped by security, who just opens fire, because I mean, well, it is Gotham. This hasty trigger figure reaction destroys the mechanism that the mysterious figure was carrying, and we get some melodramatic narration that things are about to go down. Henry Matlock has been a night watchman at this facility for the past 5 years. For 20 years before that, he was one of Gotham's finest, receiving 3 letters of commendation. He just bought a boat and named it the True Love. Clayface is going to spare him at first, saying that the fever is not upon him, but as he turns to leave, he clenches his fists, grits his teeth, but still, against all effort of will, he screams. He returns to the guard and apologizes, and for the first time we see his face, melting, held in shape by the exoskeleton he wears. And so he touches him and a transformation takes place, leaving the man as a lump of protoplasm. We interrupt this melting to bring you Bruce Wayne, not handling his breakup. This is all your fault. You, my dear departed parents. If you hadn't died, there would never have been any need for the Batman. Maybe? I mean, I don't know. I've seen alternate timelines that beg to differ. I could have lived a normal life like any other man. I could have. Oh my God. Forgive me. He'll be fine. But you know who won't? The man who got melted. We see that our third Clayface has taken up residence in an abandoned wax museum, because Gotham has an abandoned location for everyone. Whatever theme or gimmick you pick, there is an abandoned building for you. Inside, he's having dinner with Helena. I'm gonna cut to the chase. Helena is a mannequin, so she doesn't mind hearing his backstory for what I'm sure is about the 20th time. Backstory time. Preston Payne was born with hyperpituitaryism, which is a real thing, and to this story's credit, it gets it and the effects right. He becomes acromegalic, and this is when the pituitary gland produces too much growth hormone, resulting in atypical and disproportionate growth in the feet, hands, and face, which can vary in severity. His was a more pronounced case, which caused him to be what he describes as hideously distorted. He is shunned by people all throughout his childhood, but he has been gifted with a huge intellect and imagination, and so he finds solace in his studies and in reading books. He works hard, gets a job at Star Labs, and hopes that things will be different and that he'll find acceptance among adults. But sadly, he learns what most who enter adulthood do, that it's not all that different from childhood when it comes to how people interact with each other. He's still shunned, and there's this super sad panel of him eating alone. It hurts. Solo lunch life is only fun if you choose the solo lunch life. Desperate, he seeks out plastic surgeon after plastic surgeon, but they all say there's nothing they can do. Then he learns about Clayface. In his desperation, he goes to Matt Hagen, visits him in prison, begging him to learn his secret so that he too can transform and look how he wants to. But by this point, the pool where Hagen had got his powers was destroyed. But Hagen gives him the next best thing, a blood sample for him to work with. We only get this exchange in flashback, which is too bad because I really want to know what he said to Hagen to get him to give him his blood. Amiable guy Hagen strikes again. So Payne works to isolate the properties in Hagen's blood that allow him to shift, and once he's done it, with no trial or test period, injects it straight into his veins. It works at first, and Payne instantly sets about going out in the town with a lady, hitting the clubs, but alas, it is not to be. Hagen's powers do not react well with Payne. The change doesn't stop. Your face! What's happening to your face? The mutagenic properties combined with with something in his body, perhaps the very disease he sought to cure, and it morphed, making him worse. It's literally melting him, and it's now become something that he can transfer. Not his original disease, but this melting protoplasm ooze that he's become. This results in the people turning into that goo that we saw on the cover. If he does not do this, he experiences pain as it builds up in his body, a body which now needs a containment suit to hold its shape while he searches for a cure. But he's still searching, and the fever still comes upon him. At first he tried to ignore it, but the agony slowly drove him mad, and so he went out into Gotham, seeking out vagrants and derelicts, people he assumed wouldn't be missed. Ah yes, good vampire rules. He's been trying to keep it together, but the murder, the stress, the pain, they've all pushed him further over the edge than he realizes. Finding you here when I commandeered this old wax museum is the only thing which has thus far saved my sanity. Without you, sweet Helena, I would surely have gone mad. Cause he can touch her without fear of her melting, and he's convinced himself that she's real, and he's lonely, and this is sad and depressing. Clayface needs more parts for his cure, which leads him into conflict with Batman, and we learn that his exoskeleton also increases his strength. I mean, go big or go home. As they fight, the fever strikes, and he seeks to relieve the pain and destroy Batman. Part 2, Clayface and his touch of death. Hey! New Hawkman adventures. If a man be made of clay. Good title. Forgive me, my friend, but I only do what I must to survive. Batman just accepts him calling him Clayface. Good for him. It's like, oh, another Clayface. All right then. He stays in the swing. He doesn't let himself get touched. He saw what happened to those other people. He electrocutes him instead. And we see his pain escapes and he blames himself. He feels it was his vanity that brought this upon him. Why couldn't he just accept his lifelong ugliness? If it wouldn't kill me, I'd offer Payne a hug. Seems like he needs one. Ultimately, this first encounter between Batman and this Clayman comes to a head at the factory, the wax factory where he's holed up, just as he's about to turn on the machine to cure himself. Ain't it always the way? Then, dear Helena, I will be able to love you, so you deserve to be loved. Stop, you're making me sad, 1978. Curse you. You've destroyed everything. My machinery. My last hope of being human again. Batman, who still doesn't understand what's going on with this Clayface, apprehends him. But the building is on fire and Clayface runs back inside to try and save Helena. Our issue ends with them not finding a body in the wreckage, for Payne is still out there. This one is an interesting introduction. It follows the same beats as the last two who were Clayface. We learn about Clayface's origins, we do the whole who is Clayface, and there's a final battle and he's apprehended. Or in this case, almost apprehended. But this one has a lot more of a tragic human element to it. It really reflects the Bronze Age and how they were moving towards more humanistic storytelling. At least at DC. Marvel moved there earlier, but again, that's because there's a difference between the Silver Age and the Marvel Renaissance, which was allowed to happen because of the differences in the eras and how they started. Because Marvel starts at the beginning of the 60s, whereas DC had been there from the beginning and had to go through all the trials and the hearings and the seduction of the innocent and the juvenile delinquency, just very different environments. Marvel had been there too, but it wasn't called Marvel at the time. It's complicated. Let's leave that alone. Payne. The fact that we know more about Clayface than Batman does alter how this story reads. You feel sorry for Clayface. He's killing people and he's dangerous and he's clearly become unhinged. But the story takes the time to let you know how he came to this. And also he expresses remorse, which is a big deal. Cause not all Batman villains do. Yes, it just info dumps you, but it's a compelling info dump. Now there is the potential to view this as a problematic depiction of those with illnesses. You know, fear them, they're dangerous. But for me, the story at least doesn't do that. If anything, it presents us regular people as the monsters for being the force that drove Payne to such desperation that he would do anything to try to look normal. Consequences be damned. Inject it straight into the veins. Mad scientist style. He blames himself as well and doesn't revel in what he's become, but also takes few pains, pun intended, to find alternate ways to alleviate his condition other than killing people. Like, does it work on animals? Has he tested other methods? Did all that time go into making the exoskeleton extra strong? It's presented as he's too far gone. The lucidity is not always there. The intent is there to make him tragic, if not sympathetic. Mileage will vary on whether this works for you or not. And depending upon the writer and how deft their hand is, it could veer into exploitative territory. He follows a lot of vampire tropes with some added body horror elements. It's that body horror that's why it's best to keep the illness metaphors with him to a minimum, unless you have a clear, decisive, clever, tactful, thoughtful hand. Otherwise, it's better to live in monster trope land or keep those allegories light in the background. Allow the audience, the reader, to impose them upon the narrative rather than beating them over the head with it. In Clayface lore terms, we now add melting to the lexicon of powers. Melting others, that is. And it will be passed down to future Clayfaces. He can't shift into anyone though, and that alters the dynamic and changes the type of story you can tell. This one has a slower, more classic horror movie pace, harkening back to the Golden Age version. However, again, this version feels a bit narrow, like there are only so many stories to be told. Plus, you're rooting for him to get cured, and then, you know, answer for all all those vagrants he killed. Cause despite what he thinks, I'm sure somebody missed them. I know he's trying to rationalize it, but yeah, sorry Preston. Payne ultimately finds love with another Clayface, who loves him as he is, in that form, and they have a child together. Happiness, at least temporarily for Preston. Poor Preston. Driven mad not just by pain, but by loneliness in a society that refused to accept him. Sad times at the Gotham Wax Museum. Oh, he saved Helena, by the way, and married her for a little bit, and then kept her in his cell at Arkham for a bit. That was a thing that happened. Batman Annual number 11 has a very compelling telling of a romantic in quotation marks, escapade with them. It's really interesting, well worth a read. Now, Preston was created in 1978, but his condition would be mined for allegory years later, and he would be used by Grant Morrison in 1989's Arkham Asylum, a serious house on serious Earth, which most just call Batman, Arkham Asylum. I have quotes, I'm not just tossing things at you, here are some script notes from the book. Cut to a close-up on Clayface's hand. His glove has been removed to expose his melted, deformed flesh. His skin glows with an unhealthy, spectral luminescence. He trails his fingers slowly along the wall of a corridor. The paint on the wall bubbles and runs under his withering touch. As with other villains, Clayface is being given a slightly different portrayal than usual. He is seen here as an avatar of filth and corruption, the personification of pestilence and infection, whose impure touch carries instant contagion. Alert readers will perceive him as AIDS on two legs and realize that he represents the fear of what lies beyond the curtain in the tunnel of love. If we take all the encounters with villains as corresponding to various psychological states, then this one is Batman's fear of sexuality as something intrinsically unclean. The portrayal of Batman here is quite important. His posture reveals a man constantly on the defensive, constantly expecting an attack from some quarter. His body is fortress of flesh, bulwarked against the ravages of a merciless world. Consequently, he stands perfectly straight to the point of stiffness. We can imagine him walking with his buttocks clenched. His is the posture of an obsessive, anal personality. This Batman is a frightened, threatened boy who has made himself terrible at the cost of his own humanity. He is completely incapable of any kind of sexual relationship. He has made himself hard and domineering in order that he might never be hurt or abandoned again. I don't need to say it, but I will anyway. Mileage varies when it comes to this story and the depictions within it. While some felt it worked well as this was meant to be Batman's perspective, firstly, you have to buy into this portrayal of Batman, and secondly, some felt that it came across as a vilification of people suffering with AIDS, which can potentially be the perception, whether you accept this view of Batman and presenting his insecurities or not. But if you've already rejected it, you're more likely to be critical of other things, making people uncomfortable for the wrong reasons, basically. Something about the phrase, "I just want to share my disease," doesn't fully sit right, at least not with me. I don't know, I'm not sure if they found the balance in this story, what they were going for. I can see why he was chosen for this metaphor. The blood transference, the fever, people's fears of touching him. It's the execution for me that rankles. But I've heard it both ways. Speaking of AIDS coding, some feel that's also happening to Matt Hagen in the Feet of Clay episode in Batman the Animated Series, and that he's also coded as being in a relationship with his assistant/friend. I see it. That's a discussion for another day. Back to Payne. Making him a direct analogy like this doesn't fully fit, especially as he already started off with a real disease. That's then kind of being written off for this allegory. But again, this is a separate Elseworlds kind of thing. Depictions in that book in general would be a huge sidebar. Another day maybe. What happened to Preston? Well, Payne met a sad end in Cry for Justice, the series known for killing Leanne Harper, Roy Harper's daughter, sending him back on the path towards drug addiction. The series that took a panel out to talk about Hal Jordan's threesome that started a meta comic book fight between two creators, which we've talked about, Card and Link. Now the series that forced Payne to work with villain Prometheus. This because Prometheus was threatening his son Cassius. Prometheus mutated Preston further so he could shapeshift and hit a bomb in him, which he later detonated. And we were left on a "did he make it" question. Most threads from Cry for Justice were not picked up. Sad, because prior to this, Preston was even working on a way to manage his pain and had gotten to a point where he didn't have to infect others. Cry for justice! Makes me want to cry for something, that's for sure. So that was Preston Payne. Share your thoughts down below. One face, two face, three face, Clayface. I want to hear what you have to say down below. Which Clayface depiction so far has been your favorite? Golden, silver, bronze, all. Give me your reasons. And while you're down there, please do all the YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell notifications so that you never miss a vid. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to spend discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye!